was a classified briefing. Although it wasn't in a skiff, it was in a conference room at Trump Tower. It was a classified briefing, and so I wrote that on a classified device. The one I started typing in the car, that was a classified laptop that I started working on.
Any reason in a classified environment in a skiff that this committee would not be appropriate to see those communications from, at least from your perspective as the author?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Comey, when you were terminated at the FBI, I said, and you still continue.
Republican Roy Blunt of Missouri.
Continue to feel that you have provided years of great service to the country. I also said that I'd had significant questions over the last year about some of the decisions you made. If the president hadn't terminated your service, would you still be, in your opinion, the director of the FBI today?
Yes, sir.
You're listening to live coverage of former FBI Director James Comey testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee from NPR News.
Serious and troublesome, but continued to show up for work the next day.
Yes, sir.
And 6 weeks later, we're telling the president on March the 30th that he was not personally the target of any investigation.
Correct. On March the 30th, and I think again on April 11th as well, I told him we're not investigating him personally. That was true.
Well, the point to me, the concern to me there is that all these things are going on. You now, in retrospect, or at least you now, to this committee, that you had serious concerns about what the president had, you believe, directed you to do, and had taken no action, hadn't even reported up the chain of command, assuming you believe there isn't up the chain of command, that these things had happened. Do you have a sense of that, looking back, that was a mistake?
No. In fact, I think no action was the most important thing I could do to make sure there was no interference with the investigation.
And on the Flynn issue specifically, I believe you said earlier that you believe the president was suggesting you drop any investigation of Flynn's account of his conversation with the Russian ambassador, which was essentially misleading the vice president and others.
Correct. And I'm not going to go into the details, but whether there were false statements made to government investigators as well.
Any suggestion that General Flynn had violated the Logan Act, I always find pretty incredible. The Logan Act's been on the books for over 200 years. Nobody's ever been prosecuted for violating the Logan Act. My sense would be that the discussion, not the problem, misleading investigators or the vice president might have been.
That's fair. Yes, sir.
And had you previously on February the 14th discussed with the president in the previous meeting anything your investigators had learned or their impressions from talking to Flynn?
No, sir.
So he said he's a good guy, you said he's a good guy, and that was no further action taken on that.
Well, he said more than that, but there was the action was, I wrote it up, briefed our senior team, tried to figure out what to do with it, and just made a decision. We're going to hold this and then see what we make of it down the road. Yes, sir.
Is it your view that not briefing up meant you really had no responsibility to report that to the Justice Department in some way?
I think at some point, and I don't know what Director Mueller is going to do with it, but at some point, I was sure we were going to brief it to the team in charge of the case. But our judgment was, in the short term, doesn't make sense to, no fuzz on the fact that I reported to the Attorney General. That's why I stressed he shouldn't be kicked out of the room. But it didn't make sense to report to him now.
You know, you said the Attorney General said, I don't want to be in the room with him alone again, but you continued to talk to him on the phone. What is the difference in being in the room alone with him and talking to him on the phone alone?
Yeah, I think what I stressed to the Attorney General was a little broader than just the room. I said, I report to you. It's very important you be between me and the White House.
After that discussion with the Attorney General, did you take phone calls from the president?
Yes, sir.
So why did you just say you need to talk to, why didn't you say I'm not taking that call, you need to talk to the Attorney General?
Well, I did on the April 11th call, and I reported the calls, the March 30th call and the April 11th call, to my superior, who is the acting Deputy Attorney General.
I don't want to run out of time here. Let me make one other point. In reading your testimony, January the 3rd, January the 27th, and March the 30th, it appears to me that on all three of those occasions, You, unsolicited by the president, made the point to him that he was not a target of an investigation.
Correct, yes, sir.
One, I thought the March 30th, very interesting. You said, well, even though you may not want us, that was the 27th, where he said, why don't you look into that dossier thing more? You said, well, you may not want that because then we couldn't tell you, we couldn't say we couldn't answer the question about you being a target of the investigation, but you didn't seem to be answering that question anyhow. As Senator Rubio pointed out, the one unanswered, unleaked question seems to have been that in this whole period of time. But you said something earlier I don't want to fail to follow up on. You said after you were dismissed, you gave information to a friend so that friend could get that information into the public media.
Correct.
What kind of information was that? What kind of information did you give to a friend?
That the Flynn conversation, that the president had asked me to let the Flynn, I'm forgetting my exact own words, but the conversation in the Oval Office.
So you didn't consider your memo or your sense of that conversation to be a government document. You consider it to be somehow your own personal document that you could share with the media as you wanted to?
Correct. I understood this to be my recollection recorded of my conversation with the president. As a private citizen, I felt free to share that. I thought it very important to get it out.
So were all of your memos that you recorded on classified or other documents, memos that might be yours as a private citizen?
I'm sorry, I'm not following the question.
Well, I think you said you'd use classified.
Oh yeah, not the classified documents. Unclassified, I don't have any of them anymore. I gave them to the special counsel, but yeah, my view was that the content of those unclassified, the memorialization of those conversations was my recollection recorded.
So why didn't you give those to somebody yourself rather than give them through a third party?
Because I was worried the media was camping at the end of my driveway at that point, and I was actually going out of town with my wife to hide, and I worried it would be like feeding seagulls at the beach if it was I who gave it to the media. So I asked my friend, make sure this gets out.
It does seem to me that what you do there is create a source close to the former director of the FBI, as opposed to just taking responsibility yourself for saying, here are these records. And like everybody else, I have other things I'd like to get into, but I'm out of time.
Okay. Senator King.
Thank you. First, I'd like to acknowledge Senator Blumenthal.
Democrat Angus King up
Also,
next.
I think the one principal thing you'll learn today, Senator, is that the chairs there are less comfortable than the chairs here. Mr. Comey, a broad question. Was the Russian activity in the 2016 election a one-off proposition, or is this part of a long-term strategy? Will they be back?
Oh, it's a long-term practice of theirs. It stepped up a notch in a significant way in 16. They'll be back.
And I think that's very important for the American people to understand that this is very much a forward-looking investigation in terms of how do we understand what they did and how do we prevent it. Would you agree that that's a big part of our role here?
Yes, sir, and it's not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It really is an American thing. They're going to come for whatever party they choose to try and work on behalf of, and they're not devoted to either, in my experience. They're just about their own advantage, and they will be back.
That's my observation. I don't think Putin is a Republican or a Democrat. He's an opportunist.
I think that's a fair statement.
With regard to several of these conversations, in his interview with Lester Holt on NBC, the president said, I had dinner with him. He wanted to have dinner because he wanted to stay on. Is this an accurate statement?
No, sir.
Did you in any way initiate that dinner?
No. He called me at my desk at lunchtime and asked me, was I free for dinner that night? I called himself and said, can you come over for dinner tonight? And I said, yes, sir. He said, will 6 work? I think he said 6 first. And then he said, I was going to invite your whole family, but we'll do that next time. I wanted you to come over. And is that a good time? I said, sir, whatever works for you. And then he said, how about 6:30? And I said, whatever works for you, sir. And then I hung up and had to call my wife and break a date with her. I was supposed to take her out to dinner that night. And
That's one of the all-time great excuses for breaking it.
Yeah. In retrospect, I love spending time with my wife. I wish I'd been there that night.
That's one question I'm not going to follow up, Mr. Cooper. But in that same interview, the president said, in one case I called him and in one case he called me. Is that an accurate statement?
No.
Did you ever call the president?
No. I might. The only reason I'm hesitating is I think there was at least one conversation where I was asked to call the White House switchboard to be connected to him, but I never initiated a communication with the president.
And in his press conference on May 18th, the president was asked whether he had urged you to shut down the investigation into Michael Flynn. The president responded, quote, no, no. Next question. Is that an accurate statement?
I don't believe it is.
Thank you. With regard to the question of him being personally under investigation, does that mean that the dossier is not being reviewed or investigated or followed up on in any way?
I obviously can't comment either way. I can't talk in an open setting about the investigation as it was when I was the head of the FBI, and obviously it's Director Bob Mueller's responsibility now, so I don't know.
So clearly your statements to the president back in these various times when you assured him he wasn't under investigation were as of that moment. Is that correct? Is it
Correct.
not?
Correct.
Now, on the Flynn investigation, is it not true that Mr. Flynn was and is a central figure in this entire investigation of the relationship between the Trump campaign and the Russians?
I can't answer that in an open setting, sir.
Certainly Mr. Flynn was part of the so-called Russian investigation. Can you answer that question?
I have to give you the same answer.
All right. We'll be having a closed session shortly, so we will follow up on that. In terms of his comments to you about, I think in response to Mr. Risch, Senator Risch, he said, I hope you will hold back on that. But when when a president of the United States in the Oval Office says something like "I hope" or "I suggest" or "would you," do you take that as a directive?
Yes. Yes, it rings in my ears kind of, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?
I was just going to quote that in 1170, December 29, Henry II said, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest? And then the next day he was killed. Thomas à Becket. That's exactly the same situation. We're thinking along the same lines. Several other